Welcome to our unit, World War I at the Homefront and Abroad. Mobilization, women's suffrage, ethnic repression, and the elusive quest for a world system. U.S. involvement in World War I shaped American society and the post-World War I order to a decisive extent. While Americans had entered the conflict reluctantly, they emerged out of the war as a clear victor with ambitions to remake the world order through liberal democracy. These hopes shattered quickly, in part because President Wilson proved too uncompromising when negotiating with the American Congress. At the home front, the United States also underwent enormous change. During World War I, the economy was revamped. Countless women entered the workforce to fill in for the soldiers that had left to fight in Europe. This shift in the composition of the workplace propelled the momentum toward women's suffrage. African Americans, too, increasingly left the South in search for a less discriminatory, that is more tolerable, life and better employment in the North. German Americans, German immigrants, anti-war demonstrators, and suspected communists, in turn, suffered from intense governmental repression amidst an heightened American atmosphere of paranoia about traitors and security threats. After World War I, many Americans claimed that it had been a mistake to have entered the conflict, believing that the United States ought to play no permanent military role in Europe. Yet, the experience of World War II would rectify that perception about World War I. Let us look at the United States and its global role prior to World War I. In 1898, the United States had joined the ranks of Western nations that controlled overseas territories. The acquisition of a land strip in Panama and the subsequent building of the Canal Zone in Panama, completed in 1914, also spoke to American ingenuity and its sense of world mission. The Panama Canal lowered the distance for shipping from New York, on the East Coast, to San Francisco, on the West Coast, from 13,600 miles to 5,300 miles. Benefiting the U.S. economy significantly. Before the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the U.S. economy was already the largest in the world. Despite its enormous economic clout, large landmass, and overseas possessions, the United States was unique in a military sense. Prior to World War II, U.S. military spending was comparatively limited. The Civil War and the Spanish-American War excepted, of course. In 1913, for instance, the year before World War I broke out, U.S. military expenditures were lower than Germany's and about the same as Great Britain's, even though the U.S. economy was larger than the combined economies of Germany and Great Britain. Some historians have argued that the United States was able to maintain a smaller military because Great Britain, seeking worldwide naval dominance, was patrolling the Atlantic to the benefit of American security. This concept is known as free security. Still, the United States slowly but surely asserted itself more aggressively in world affairs. In the years prior to the American entrance into World War I, April 1917, the United States dominated other economies through financial investments, used gunboat diplomacy, and invaded and occupied other nations, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. The origins of World War I are complicated, and one could spend an entire course discussing them. In a nutshell, however, one could summarize them as follows. Ever since the unification of Germany in 1871, Germany had sought to enter the ranks of world powers. It was especially during the reign of German Emperor William II, 1890 to 1918, that Germany grew more aggressive in challenging and provoking other European powers. Particularly Germany's naval buildup concerned Great Britain, whose enormous overseas empire depended on naval supremacy. Even more important, Great Britain was located on islands and thus dependent on food imports. Britons were highly susceptible to fears of a naval blockade and the potential mass starvation that could result therefrom. Germany, however, exhibited little understanding for Britain's dilemma and kept increasing its naval force to the anger of Great Britain and other powers. Such a lack of tact brought Great Britain closer to France and Russia, leading to the creation of the Triple Entente alliance between these three powers. Germany, in turn, reached out to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central Europe and Italy, these countries being known as the Central Powers. Note that Italy would ultimately betray the alliance and join the Entente powers in 1915, while the Ottoman Empire would join the Central Powers. A series of diplomatic crises and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria led to the eventual eruption of war in August 1914. Millions of European soldiers rejoiced as they expected a short war in which they could fight honorably for the patria. World War I lasted significantly longer than any power had expected. Europeans, supported by soldiers of color from colonial empires, especially Indians who fought for Great Britain, engaged in over 4 years of brutal trench warfare and senseless slaughtering that cost millions of casualties. The United States initially tried to remain neutral in the conflict. Yet Americans showed their pro-Entente bias early and chose to trade with Great Britain and France significantly more than with Germany. Of course, this was also a geographic reality, considering that Germany was farther east and more difficult to access via the Atlantic. President Woodrow Wilson made a point that Americans would insist on the right to trade with both war parties during the conflict. Trading had become enormously profitable for the United States, since higher war demands were hiking up prices. Yet, from Germany's viewpoint, American trade with Great Britain undercut German war efforts, since Germany simply could not defeat Great Britain as long as it continued to receive ample supplies by Americans. To weaken Britain, German submarines attacked British shipping, including passenger ships that smuggled arms and weaponry. One such passenger ship with hidden weaponry was the Lusitania, which, to the chagrin of Britons and Americans, Germans sunk in May 1915. Since more than 100 American civilian passengers, and many more Britons, died on the Lusitania, President Wilson issued a statement that condemned this act and warned Germans. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, the former Democratic presidential nominee, on the other hand, resigned in reaction to Wilson's statement because he opined that Wilson was unduly partial to Great Britain and leading the United States on the path of war. The next year, German submarines sunk a French passenger ship, the Sussex. Although this time only 2 Americans were injured, Wilson took it upon himself to threaten an end to diplomatic relations with Imperial Germany. In reaction, Germans took the Sussex Pledge and promised they would refrain from attacking shipping in the future. The United States finally declared war on Germany in April 1917 after 2 key events had taken place. Americans had become aware of the Zimmermann Note, thanks to British intelligence, and Germans had broken the Sussex Pledge, attacking American trade ships headed for Great Britain via unrelenting submarine warfare. The impact of American soldiers fighting on the side of Great Britain and France as an associated power rather than an ally was more psychological and economic than militarily significant, especially considering that most Americans were relatively untrained in military combat. While American soldiers under the leadership of General John Pershing clearly fought bravely, more than 100,000 American soldiers died in World War I, the main effect of American war efforts was to make Germany realize that it stood virtually no chance to emerge victorious. The United States, after all, possessed enormous economic resources and had mobilized more than 4 million soldiers. On November 11, 1918, German generals surrendered even though most of German territory was still unoccupied by foreign powers. At home, World War I created an atmosphere of coercion and oppression. The Selective Service Act of 1917, for instance, forced Americans to enlist in the military and thus potentially sacrifice their lives on behalf of the patria. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 severely limited civil liberties for all Americans, cracking down on those who questioned the war effort. giving the government the ability to force citizens into military service. Many Americans on the left, suspected communists, German Americans, and pacifists, many pacifists objected to violence out of religious grounds, suffered governmental repression, including jail. Most state legislatures also purged the German language from public institutions. Whereas German had been a common language in American schools, churches, homes, and elsewhere before the outbreak of World War I, it had little prominence thereafter in US society. During the war, the government also infringed on US liberties in other ways, secretly opening citizens' mail, censoring the freedom of speech, exhibiting marked paranoia about German conspiracies and spies, and forcing numerous conscientious objectors to serve in the military. Towards the end of the war, in March 1918, Wilson did make arrangements so that conscientious objectors could serve in the military in a civil fashion, for instance by building bridges rather than using a rifle, and more generally many repressive measures subsided after the war was over. Still, governmental repression was palpable in the late 19-teens. To many US officials, African Americans, moreover, had no place in the nation and were generally not welcome to combat on behalf of the United States. Although almost 400,000 African American men served in the US military during World War I, white officials excluded more than 2 million African Americans who had enlisted in military service. The government also turned away numerous black nurses who volunteered to serve on behalf of their country. Many American women volunteered their spare hours advertising the sale of bonds to the government to raise revenue for the US military. They also increasingly moved into the workforce while remaining in charge of raising children, thus assuming the so-called double shift. Yet, male US politicians became more opposed to granting women suffrage rights while the United States was at war, claiming that World War I was not the right time to rock the boat. Several suffragettes, such as Alice Paul, disagreed vehemently. Altogether, however, women's actions during the war helped further the suffragists' cause, an old cause of progressivism. In 1920, 2 years after the end of World War I, the ratification of the 19th Amendment guaranteed all women above 21 the nominal right to vote. Note that it was not until 1971 that US citizens above 18 could vote, thanks to the 26th Amendment, and, of course, numerous white Southerners used violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans, male and female, from voting well into the late 1960s. And even in the 21st century, conservative politicians continued to infringe upon minorities' ability to vote freely. During World War I, more than 500,000 African Americans from the South escaped sharecropping and moved to the North, especially Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit, searching for remunerative employment in industrial plants. In part, African Americans benefited from the cutoff of immigrant labor from Europe that had resulted from the outbreak of World War I. African Americans also benefited from more restrictive US immigration policies. While most African Americans took solace in their new northern homes and generally remained there, many nonetheless continued to face segregation and white violence, including the infamous East St. Louis race riots in 1917. Not only did the United States change significantly at home, it also shaped the outlook and ideas of millions of other people worldwide. During World War I, President Wilson, a political scientist and historian, had looked at Europe and reflected on centuries of European warfare. He aimed to put an end to worldwide conflict once and for all and became a key figure during the peace negotiations at Versailles between November 1918 and June 1919, which remade the entire European map at the expense of the Central Powers and to the benefit of oppressed European peoples such as Poles and Czechs. Rather than seeking to perpetuate the legacy of European security dilemmas that propelled warfare, Wilson proposed an alternate blueprint for the post-World War I order through collective security, as enshrined in the League of Nations. Wilson's rhetoric of self-government was also an attempt to undercut workers' search for worldwide revolution. Russia, after all, had become the first communistic country in history in November 1917. Fears that communism would reach American shores not only explained in part Wilson's liberal rhetoric, but also the increased governmental crackdown on communists in the United States during World War I. Wilson saw himself as a defender of weaker nations in Europe, but was generally unwilling to support the rights of those outside of Europe, since he deemed peoples of color unfit for self-government. Still, Wilsonian rhetoric had an unintended impact, inspiring non-Western peoples all over the world, including China, Korea, and Egypt, all of which spoke out vociferously on behalf of their rights, protesting European colonialism. The idea of a League of Nations was enormously popular among citizens of war-torn Europe. Most governments in Europe, on the other hand, accepted the idea of a League of Nations, but not Wilson's vision of a new international order. That is, certain governments like the British and the French counted on future US help to prevent renewed warfare within Europe. The British and French governments also sought to punish, however, and weaken the former German and Austro-Hungarian empires, having no intentions of relinquishing their own empires. Wilson, in the end, never succeeded in crafting a peace plan and post-war order that could bridge this dilemma and other contradictions. More significantly, Wilson failed to persuade the US Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, thus falling short of guaranteeing US membership in the League of Nations. Several historians have argued that this was to an important extent Wilson's own fault, since he failed to compromise and explain himself well to American audiences. Numerous so-called moderate reservationists in the Senate, such as Henry Cabot Lodge and Robert La Follette Sr. from the Republican Party, had serious concerns that Article 10 of the League of Nations would force Americans to become embroiled in warfare on behalf of other nations, even when the United States had nothing obvious to gain from a military commitment. Wilson downplayed this possibility, while at the same time averring that without Article 10 the League was useless. Stubbornly, Wilson opposed the changing of the treaty, repeatedly directing Democratic senators to vote against US membership in the League of Nations whenever it contained clauses by Republicans that sought to attach conditions or make exceptions for American membership in the League. Wilson's tenacity killed the possibility of US membership altogether. The League of Nations, Wilson's brainchild, came into existence without the United States, undoubtedly to the detriment of the League itself. Not until World War II would Americans directly involve themselves again in the security affairs of Europeans and the world more broadly. Indeed, the experience of World War II 20 years later convinced many Americans that a non-commitment to world security affairs could not be repeated. Americans became the centerpiece of the United Nations, the successor of the League of Nations. To conclude, World War I brought forward a panoply of changes for Americans and the world. At the home front, Americans of many strides experienced increased governmental repression. Many women and African Americans, however, benefited from and harnessed opportunities that arose during and immediately after World War I. Internationally, Americans entered World War I reluctantly. Still, US involvement in World War I provided a crucial economic and psychological boost to the cause of the Entente powers. For the first time in US history, Americans sat at the forefront of trying to recreate the world order. A pet project without lasting success that nonetheless set important precedents for World War II.